Yeah, I mean,
Where do we start?
I think yeah, we can start. I can start by asking you a question, the most intriguing one. I think I just want to check what's kind of the status quo in world affairs right now, and I think the most important event is 2024 American elections. So I would say, do you think a lot is at stake in those elections, in American elections? I mean,
It's a tricky question because
yeah,
it assumes that America is still, the dominant force in global affairs, and that is, I think, correct to a certain extent. But at the same time, we see, I mean, some people would maybe call it a power vacuum. If you look at the election outcomes in Venezuela, where apparently Nicolas Maduro was reelected, if you see the kind of two recent campaigns or assassinations, one in Tehran and the other one in Beirut, right, by the Israelis, who have neither confirmed it nor denied it. And if you see this prisoner exchange that happened, I mean, there are, well, of course, there the Americans were involved, but I mean, also provocations by the Chinese when it comes to Taiwanese waters. I mean, I think it's tricky to say. I mean, because I think as such, the American influence has been waning. That would be my assumption, at least when we look at the last 4 years. And of course, if you look at the electoral campaigns, there is one party that is pushing that more isolationist position, right? Especially with the running mate J.D. Vance. So if they really were to implement that program, we might see even more of, conflicts arising, or I mean, turbulent world events. Let's put it that way.
But it's also not very clear what they stand for, because I mean, of course, in relation to Ukraine, it's somewhat clear that they're not. They do not support the current policy towards Ukraine, so they want to change something. But then the question is how this change is going to look like, whether it's going to look like complete withdrawal or some like less support for Ukraine. I mean, my
what do you mean by withdrawal? You mean withdrawing of arms supplies?
Yes, of like any support, which I mean seems very doubtful that they can accomplish this. Even if, I mean, obviously, like it's prerogative of the president, but there's still a lot at stake. So I don't think they can just ditch the whole support. And also in relation to China, I'm not sure, because I feel Trump agenda towards China is actually way much more radical than even Biden. So you have like all those sort of, because like Trump is also one, like he wants to be seen as a tough person, as a tough leader. And when he says that, the conflict wouldn't have happened if I were president, he means that not that he would go and talk to Putin. I think like he means that he would have been like such a strong leader that Putin wouldn't be as advantageous, as courageous to go to Ukraine. Which I mean, it's not, I guess, black and. I just want to say it's not just black and white in relation to Trump if he is elected. I think there is a lot of kind of uncertainties, and I think they will try to figure it out. If he's elected, they will try, because I feel foreign policy is not his biggest kind of. I mean, it is part of his agenda, but it's not his biggest, so to speak, card, so to speak, right? He's not that type of politician who can really maybe understand the whole complexity of world politics. He's more, of course, he has like this agenda of isolationism, but it also comes with this idea that we need to make America great again. So it's also like, you know what I mean? It's not that black and white. So I think it's more complicated.
I mean, I would say if we take the first 4 years of his presidency as a kind of template or something that what might come as a new policy agenda. In terms of foreign policy, I would see three aspects. One is there will certainly be strong hiccups and turbulences in world trade, because I mean the entire obsession with trade deficits and seemingly or allegedly unfair trade practices will basically mean that countries like China and Germany will be penalized or punished by import tariffs, for instance. So that's pretty clear. Whether the isolationism really plays out also in a way to pull out of NATO is something I wouldn't dare to say. I think there is one aspect that you mentioned earlier, and that is I think there is a difference between the political decisions that Trump has been taking or that Trump took during his presidency and the kind of rhetoric he used primarily vis-a-vis American voters. So I think isolationism in a way to not engage in a lot of conflicts is something that he says he would do, or that he wouldn't take part in conflicts or would not start any wars. That's, I think, one of the ways he tries to frame it. Whether he can actually deliver on that, one would have to see. And I think the third aspect will be just also whom he will actually nominate as a foreign minister, whether there are any of those famous or infamous adults in the room, right, that back then wrote that article. So, I mean, if he has some experienced people who are still daring to serve under his administration, it might turn out not too bad. But, I mean, it's really unclear. So I think, trade will certainly see changes. The isolationist stance, I don't know. I think there is also a lot of rhetoric there because, I mean, if people look at the results of the Trump presidency, they also observed, I mean, there are a number of articles out now or, coverage that what Trump actually promised to do and what he then actually did are two different things. From building the wall to all sorts of other things. But I certainly think that it's a very uncomfortable situation, or it will be a very uncomfortable situation for Germany. Both in terms of reaching the 2% target, for spending more, or basically then replacing some of the Ukraine war effort and step up, and also all trade-related aspects. So that will certainly be, or would be, not a very nice situation for the Germans, to put it mildly.
Yeah, I've heard they're quite worried, especially in diplomatic circles. But of course, in relation to Europe, the question of Ukraine will be very interesting. My sort of feeling that even if he's elected, nothing will change drastically, just because I don't think Trump can really kind of like change the course of the whole. I mean, as of now, it's kind of like European history and just, go and talk to Putin and compromise with him those lands. The thing is whether he can achieve some type of negotiation between like Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and I don't know whether you can bring European partners, like especially France and Germany, and whether they can achieve some type of ceasefire and some type of settlement, which won't be political settlement, obviously, but some type of like just the end of the hostilities. I mean, I guess he can potentially do it because, I mean, as a president of the United States, he can really convene with Putin and Zelensky together with other European leaders, perhaps, and try to achieve something on this front. But as you said just before, just because one thing what Trump has to say during the campaign, I don't think it's the same thing that Trump can deliver during his presidency. And I think here, just because I would still think that support of Ukraine is kind of like bipartisan issue, that it would be hard for him to really push for it. He can, of course, mediate. This is how I see his like role if he wants to kind of end this conflict, is like a mediator between Russia and Ukraine. Certainly he can try to achieve this, but most likely they're going to just kind of like freeze the conflict as it is, so to speak, which may include some type of formal or non-formal ceasefire. This is kind of like my sort of prediction. But of course, I mean, there is a lot. If just talking about from Russian perspective, definitely Russia kind of like awaits the results of those elections, because who is going to be the president is going to determine like Russian kind of policy or Russian agenda. Because
what do you think would be Russian expectations or Putin's expectation? What do you think will be different in terms of how Putin might sort of design or steer his foreign policy? I mean, with Kamala Harris or with Donald Trump, where do you see the differences?
I think what Putin really wants and what Russia kind of like wants is to freeze the conflict, probably, because my kind of thinking about this, as Russia sees it as a sort of like it's sort of like policy and position as it was in 2015, 2016. In other words, it can pass through this like with turbulent years when the sanctions hit really hard. And I agree with kind of the position that most people in Europe also have, like that Russia needs some time to kind of recuperate, to kind of like rearrange its kind of management of its resources. If it wants to build like even bigger army or what have you, if it wants to build a bigger, more sustainable economy, it needs some time off, especially of those like a massive investment in the war efforts. So I would think they really want some type of settlement for now, which I don't see. I don't see it, of course, because neither Moscow nor like Washington believe in this idea that of kind of like political agreement where you have definitely defined like, or you have some settlement where you have like clearly stated that Ukraine won't be part of NATO, right? I don't think anyone believes in this, and I don't think Trump can achieve this either, which is interesting because then you ask all those questions. Why is that? Because there is sort of like this kind of like flock dynamic in the whole conflict, when I don't think even if Trump wanted to achieve this, he could achieve this in a way, because it's like there is so much at stake and there is almost like a historical forces at play. Because there is, I mean, of course, the conflict is broadly defined from my perspective as this conflict of whether Ukraine is going to join NATO or like Western Bloc or not. And I don't think Trump can say veto this kind of decision just because there is so much already at stake, and I just don't see this. So I think...
Do you mean vetoing that Trump would actually say that no matter what, Ukraine won't become a part of NATO? That he would basically end this NATO consensus, so everything that was, again, repeated during the Washington summit, which was the line that, of course, Ukraine will be able to become part of NATO.
Yeah, I just don't see him doing this. But he's also, it's not like he has ever said publicly that he's going to end Ukrainian membership in NATO. There's a lot of ambiguity and I think uncertainty in this realm, as I guess, we discussed when after I did my research, because I mean, it's sort of kind of, there is like this almost like historical forces at play when, of course, the conflict is just about whether Ukraine can join NATO or like Western Bloc or not, and Russia is basically trying to veto this decision, right? Trying to say that no, it cannot, because we have a say here, and this is like the conflict. Kind of from my perspective, this is the conflict is all about, and of course there is like different kind of interpretations of why does Russia even need this? It's like what is this? What is there for Russia, so to speak? But eventually, I think it's all about just either Ukraine joining NATO or not. So and from Russian perspective, of course, they don't have any illusions that electing Donald Trump can change this. So they certainly understand that the US will still push for Ukraine membership in NATO, even if not now, but then later, maybe next decade. So for them, it's just important to...
So you said you wouldn't expect that the Russian side actually then sees so much of a difference in terms of the foreign policy approach of the United States vis-a-vis Russia, right? No matter whether it's Kamala Harris or
Yeah.
Trump there. I mean, how do you explain, and I mean, that really an open question, because if you read, say, American papers or a lot of European papers, they would always argue that there has been, this Russian meddling in the 2016 election, and maybe Trump was also elected because there were some, additional bots or what have you. I mean, some kind of Russian influence there. You had the Mueller report and all that stuff. Irrespective of that, I mean, or on top of that, I mean, the thing was about that future Trump administration could actually be sort of more pro-Russian or more Russia-friendly. How do you explain that? I mean, because there really seems to be a disconnect that, it's not echoed or it's not seen that way in Russia.
Oh, I think I would explain it. I would explain it by saying that, again, Russia is interested in just total instability in the United States. I mean, if you think from, Russian grand strategical perspectives, if you want to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, the best solution is to be the dissolution of NATO. Then there is no problem, really. And it's like, it can only happen if there is some chaos in the United States, so to speak. So I guess Russia sees Trump as this type of character who is like, you remember like this economist wrecking ball type of kind of like vision. This is what Russia thinks about Trump. It's someone who really breaks kind of like American institutions. And I still think they do believe in this type of narrative that Trump is just, it's better to bet on Trump, not to bet even, just like, if you want the demise of the United States and United States institutions, you need to bet on like this type of character. Someone who really breaks the status quo, so to speak.
So, as such, but then there seems to be the different perspectives that the perception of the role of Trump is then different. Whereas a lot of people, especially, say, more center-left or people on the Democratic spectrum, in the sort of Democratic Party spectrum in the US, seem to suggest that Trump is actually, in a sense, Russia-friendly or less, say, opposed to Russia than the current administration. The reason for that perception is actually that the Russians may prefer Trump, but they prefer Trump not because they think he does them any sort of foreign policy favor, but that Trump is actually creating the instability that is beneficial for Russia in a geopolitical sense.
Yeah, I think exactly. But I think Trump, again, he's not type of a person who is very kind of like confident enough in his own thinking about foreign policy. And he really relies...
He's also not consistent, because something I always thought about when we now discussed was that moment when there were people in his administration who seemed to have, you can read the stuff. I haven't read the book by John Bolton, but some snippets. But there were a number of people who were like experienced in foreign policy. And sometimes they could have Trump's ear, and the Trump administration as such was sort of pursuing along more traditional power politics, Republican style foreign policy things. And then at times Trump was apparently going it alone, such as the thing with meeting Kim Jong-un and in North Korea, because that was really criticized by almost every one of the sort of foreign policy establishment on both sides of the aisle. So and that is something I could imagine, that he sort of pulls that out of his head and comes up with that idea. Oh, I meet with Vladimir Putin, and then I also invite Zelensky, and then I come up with some kind of crazy or final settlement, and this eventually wouldn't really
change
anything in the end. So because it's the same thing about, I actually want to ensure that North Korea is not going nuclear.
No, I think
see what happened. It didn't work out.
No, I think this can definitely happen. I can see him arranging the meeting if he is like kind of. I would say if he can achieve it, and he can achieve it, he can arrange the meeting between Zelensky and Putin and him, or just meeting to start with, just meeting with Putin. There's already going to be like a big news, of course. It's like this, so it's a lot of media coverage. And I definitely think nothing is going to change because one thing certain is like when he was elected, I mean, nothing really changed in relationship between Russia and the US. I mean, it was the same type of slow deterioration that eventually resulted in the war in Ukraine. It's like, and he even like, famously started selling, not selling, but sending Ukraine like lethal weapons, like javelins and stuff like this during his presidency. And of course, he also had a lot of like hawks in his administration, like Bolton when he started. So it's also like, again, yeah, he's not consistent, and I guess he also relies a lot on people around him. And I don't think people around him will be like a very pro-Russian type of people, so to speak.
Because I mean, there could be, like, if you take J.D. Vance's, and he's no idea about foreign policy whatsoever. If you take his comments at face value, this would really be a very isolationist policy. At the same time, we have people like Lindsey Graham, who now apparently supports Trump. And I mean, Lindsey Graham is one of those foreign policy hawks, I mean, that you just mentioned. I mean, he would always ensure that arms supplies to Ukraine don't dry up. So I mean, I also have no idea how to evaluate that or how to assess that. I mean, what will happen? I think it's very likely that, as you said, not a lot will change, but there could be some kind of strange stunt of, hey, I'm inviting some people for a peace summit or something like that. Pretty similar to the talks that Orban had. Now recently.
I mean, the interesting question. I mean, maybe you've seen this debate. It's like it's definitely big in Russia. I guess it's also big in Europe. Whether there should be some type of peace, like just like ceasefire, is better than no peace, so to speak, at all. It's like I guess it's an interesting debate. What's your take on this? Like, I mean, and basically what the take is, like, whether just having some type of settlement now is better than having war, or vice versa.
I think that the problem of that debate, and I think the only there are two German parties who favor that. One is Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, right, on the sort of arguably still more the political left than the political right, although some people say that she sort of has aspects of both sort of political leanings in her party, and the AfD. I think there are some, factual truths to that argument that, of course, if you were to have any, not peace agreement now, but I mean, just ceasefire, less people would die. But that's sort of something that's pretty logical. So, I mean, if you say way too many people have died, you're like a typical pacifist argument as such, wars are terrible, sure. Too many people die, yes. There are, infrastructure, buildings are destroyed. I mean, yes, that's all terrible. Just the question is, what do you make of that situation afterwards? I mean, so I think as such, it's pretty clear that less people will die. But then the question is, how do you actually start what is considered just, in quotation marks, peace settlement? And I think there you run into uncharted waters, and that is tricky. Because I mean, I think we will see how the kind of positions by the Russians and by the West and Ukraine will be squared, or how they will be reconciled once there is a peace settlement or a ceasefire. Because of course there is this line that Russia mustn't win this war, that Ukraine must win this war. I mean, these were things that we discussed. What winning means is still sort of unclear. I find it interesting that Zelensky now had this press statement or gave this speech in which he seemed to suggest that conceding territory might be possible, but that this would have to be based on a referendum or some kind of popular support by the people. But I mean, I think that is already an indication that, first of all, this naivete at the beginning, that especially with that first summer offensive, where I mean, some people said, now Ukraine is retaking all the territory that Russia conquered after February 24th, 2022, that this was not going to happen, or that this couldn't be realized. And I mean, that it will be very difficult, to say the least, to reconquer those territories in the Donbass and Lugansk. And I'm not even mentioning Crimea here. So I mean, there were those people like Ludwig, right, who already suggested that as a peace settlement. I think more than a year ago, that there needs to be a ceasefire and then some kind of referendum. Now the question is, of course, how would you organize a referendum that is not a fake referendum? So I mean, I think as with many conflicts in the world, you do have blueprints or ideas of how it could be solved, but unfortunately, it wars often seem to drag on. I mean, I also read reports that the Ukrainians have increasingly problems of recruiting people, or that the kind of rotation that is needed for soldiers actually cannot be guaranteed on both sides. You know, that, I mean, soldiers are actually serving too long at the front line. And therefore it results in higher casualties and also psychological stress and all those additional situations. So, I mean, and I think was something we discussed really early on in 2022, you really have this kind of almost cliche like fog of war thing, that you really don't know what is happening. I mean, it's very difficult to actually assess the situation. I mean, there is this Institute for the Study of War, which I think in terms of the maps has some decent coverage. But
I mean, I guess I wouldn't say it's a complete fog of war, because the previous year, basically, if we analyze just like events as they are, so to speak, I mean, I guess we can just state as a fact that Russia took a little bit of land. They had some advantages in the front line, but those advantages are a couple of not 100 maybe kilometers, so to speak. So it's not like anything big. But of course, the question, from not the factual perspective, but from positional perspective, whether Ukraine can hold up the situation where it's kind of holds the front line, and whether there can be a moment when there is some sort of drastic change. And of course, it's also interesting, I think, this whole perception of the West of what's the Russian end goal here, because I mean, the Western perception, at least in one camp, pro-war camp, is that if you allow Russia time to kind of collect its forces, to have a ceasefire, then it will attack some other NATO country, right? That's kind of the narrative that they try to portray. So you
you mentioned this, or you use the word recuperate. I mean, that would basically,
or attack again,
or attack again. So I mean, it's since you asked the question again, right? I mean, I think that's the thing about the ceasefire at the moment. Of course, it would mean less casualties now, but I mean, it's that kind of crystal ball question. I mean, does it then mean that the Russians will invest even more in the military and then start an even larger offensive in 2 years? So in the end, if you look at it and do the calculation in 5 years, even more people died. I mean, it's something we don't know. But I mean, I think a lot of that assessment hinges on the question: is the war in Ukraine really about imperial ambitions that go or include the entire territory of the former Soviet Union? Do they also want to take parts of Poland or of the Baltic states? I mean, these are arguments that are out there, and I mean, I wouldn't be able to judge that. I mean, what I can say is that it will simply be that the military resources that the Russians have won't be enough to conquer the 3 Baltic states, but again, plus Finland. Because but it all depends. Again, it all depends on the U.S. involvement. Because again, Putin is probably a type of a strategist who, because he has all the power in this, in Russia, he can just sit and wait and see what's happening in the world. And of course, it all depends on the U.S. involvement in Europe. Because again, from Russian perspective, the best case scenario is the complete American withdrawal from Europe. And I'm not saying it just because Russia wants to conquer all of Europe, because it kind of solves this whole puzzle for Russia. What's its place in Europe?
in a way that Russia can significantly increase its power projection in Europe, whether just from military or economic perspective, right? This is like very important for Russia, so to speak. And then, of course, a lot depends on what's the future of U.S. involvement in Europe. So far, there are no real indications that there's going to be some withdrawal. It's still kind of like...
Well, Trump said that he would, and then there were also some troops that were then sent to Poland. That's, again, one of the kind of contradictory signs, right? And on the one hand, he's suggesting to pull out of NATO, then he doesn't do it, then he actually sends more lethal weapons to Ukraine. At the same time, it was also under his watch that the American presence in Poland was increased. So, I mean, it's...
Yeah.
At times, they present him as the person or the president who sort of gives in and is sort of very Russia friendly, and he wasn't back then. I mean, not automatically. I mean, it was like very mixed signals, and I think geostrategically, irrespective of whether it's Kamala Harris or who, by the way, I think is a very inexperienced person, where you really don't know what will happen in terms of foreign policy, because she really doesn't have the expertise and decade-long experience of Biden. The question, I mean, they have three conflict zones. One is Europe with Ukraine, then China, Taiwan, or anything that's happening in East Asia. And then they also have the Middle East. I mean, I think where things are currently really developing in a very negative way.
I mean, for the US or
no? I mean, generally in terms of instability. I mean, I think we can expect any Iranian attack now on Israel, how that will look like, is really unclear. There could be a war technically between Israel and Lebanon, but I mean primarily involving Hezbollah militias or the Hezbollah militia. So that's all unclear. And you see that most of the, not peace negotiations, but I mean anything that is currently happening on the diplomatic level is rather run by China, for instance, or at least not all other countries than the US. So I think they're not very, very present at the moment, at least not in the Middle East. Of course, they are, sending arms to Israel, and they are supporting Israel rhetorically and in other ways. But I mean, as such, it is not they don't have a clear idea, or at least to my understanding, don't seem to have a clear strategy of, hey, how do we sort of calm down tensions in the region? How do we rein in Iran and the Houthi militia and Hezbollah? And, well, Hamas is not destroyed in a military sense, but of course has been significantly weakened. But I mean, as such, that's the kind of situation, and that's tricky.
I don't really follow closely, but I guess they still bet on pro-Israel support mostly, right? And that's why you had Netanyahu coming to Washington, which
but he left empty-handed. I mean, he didn't really get a lot of. I mean, and especially Democratic voters have. I think that popular support for Israel in the US is sort of also very high in some circles, right? For instance, among evangelicals. But I mean, first of all, the younger generation is siding less with Israel, or there is less support for that, or they're outright critical of Israel. And as such, I think that's more difficult than it used to be. I mean, sort of to garner support, to ensure broad-based support for Israel in the United States. I mean, as a policy maker or a decision maker, I think that's more, or it's not a given these days. Yeah, but I mean, of course, that also plays out how the US can conduct its foreign policy in the region or for the region.
I mean, it's like one of those things that actually can see like a disconnect between practice and theory almost, because you have like this type of theoretical debate what like the US policy should be, but I think it still remains mostly pro-Israel support, right? I mean, they still send them weapons, they still kind of support them rhetorically, and of course they also have like this debate regarding civilians and stuff like this, especially in the leftist kind of camps. But it's still mostly pro-Israeli support. I mean, I would even go as far as to say, yeah, it is just pro-Israeli support. It's kind of like betting that we just support Israel, and this is our kind of like policy here. So I mean, this is kind of.
But it's certainly anti-Iranian. It's pro-Israeli, but at the same time, they are also. I mean, they have always supported Egypt. They have, I mean, both militarily and in terms of foreign aid and financially, and of course, that's also one of the big pillars, and that's after the signing of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. So, I mean, as such, I think the ways how the Americans acquiesce or sort of kind of pacify or calm down tensions in some of the neighboring countries of Israel is also one way. I think they have less influence now in Saudi Arabia, but I mean, if you look at what they still do in terms of, you know, support for Jordan, for Egypt, I think they are, I mean, yes, it's certainly pro-Israeli, but I think it's as such it's a more complex picture. And I mean, they clearly haven't found any, no matter. I mean, if you start with the Clinton administration, they have never found any way of finding some kind of arrangement or approach to Iran that really works. I mean, you could say that JCPOA, the kind of nuclear deal with Iran, was one thing that sort of worked before Trump called it the worst deal in history, I think. And I think it was an idea to buy time. So, I mean, my reading of it as a semi-lay person is that it is something that was not the perfect solution for the problem, but it basically was something like hitting a pause button for 10 years, and it would significantly reduce Iranian chances of producing a nuclear weapon as quickly as they would have been able to do otherwise. So if that was the main goal, I mean, the agreement was sort of working okay-ish. But I mean, now you really see that it is not working. I think what is really tricky is that you see that Iran is partnering or siding with Russia, with China, and they really
now you have this
collaborate. And I mean, in terms of destabilizing the region, I think there is, you know, ample evidence for that. For that, the Iranians are doing that by proxies. You know, they have technically 3 proxies, and they used to have a strong presence also because before they pulled out of Syria, but that's, you know, a long time ago already. Yeah. And I mean, they have been destabilizing the regions for decades, I think.
And it's kind of very interesting. I mean, alliances also in a way that, I mean, what unites them is basically the common enemy, because as such, I don't see, again, much of like real collaboration between Chinese, Russian, and Iranian society. But they kind
reducing American influence, and I mean, creating this, what the Russians have been saying for decades now, this, you know, multipolar world order. I think that's really what it's all about. I mean, and it also includes then countries in Latin America or in Africa. I mean
what's interesting here, again, because like Chinese strategy is very interesting in this sense, because since China is not really involved in those conflicts, it kind of stays like, I mean, officially neutral, right? I mean, of course, not officially, it kind of like supports Russia in the war in Ukraine. It also probably supports Iran in its kind of efforts. But officially, it remains neutral, which allows China to expand like elsewhere in the world, right? I've heard there is like very big presence of China in Latin America. Apparently, a lot of investments, a lot of money is going on there, in Africa and in other places. So it's like, of course, like Chinese influence probably grew significantly, and I think because of like this Western bubble, we do not really even notice it already because it's happening so rapidly. But we kind of like, if you look at the media, kind of the media is still so biased towards what's happening in the US and like what's happening in the West. So it kind of like almost forgets this part that there is like this big changes going on. And of course you can wake up. I think it's like you can wake up is almost like in a world that is not Western anymore, so to speak.
Well, I think the problem is you see that that's a criticism that you find among the isolationists in the US, that you find where they actually sort of come to the same conclusion as some people in China or Russia, that I mean this sort of hawkish interventionist foreign policy doctrine didn't work. And what I think we can observe just as a fact is that the American or Western presence, primarily military, has been reduced, be it Afghanistan, be it Iraq, be it anything in the Sahel zone or sort of in sub-Saharan Africa. And I mean, everywhere where Western forces or Western presence was reduced, other international actors came in, primarily Chinese. And of course, that's something where, irrespective of whether it's Emmanuel Macron or Olaf Scholz or Joe Biden or any other, or Keir Starmer, I mean, any leader of the G7 or Western countries, that they must think about twice. I mean, what kind of message are we sending, and how is global politics now, changing? I think it's changing rapidly, as you say, and I mean, maybe it's less that people don't know that China is, for instance, investing heavily in infrastructure, because I mean they have been doing that for more than a decade now. The Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, and all the policy strategies, you can download them. I mean, everyone knows what the Chinese are up to, what they are. I mean, they have it put it out in writing what they intend to do.
But the results are visible now, so to speak.
The results are visible now, and I think there is no, if we want to use the word term again, Western joint strategy. I mean, how to.
Yeah.
I mean, we noticed that. I mean, there seems to be some kind of backlash against Chinese investment in Africa, where I mean, the African leaders seem to appreciate Chinese investment because they thought it doesn't come with any strings attached, right? No discourse about human rights or workers' conditions or what have you, or some kind of conditionality that Western donors gave. Now, they also see that at times they were part of the party who actually didn't benefit as much as the Chinese when it comes to the kind of the conditions of their investments. They are now part of a debt trap that they now face, but as such, it doesn't mean more influence for the West, I think. So that's very, very difficult. And for Americans who have always had a foreign policy of global engagement, I think it's really tricky to, even if they have a lot of military resources, military bases, it's difficult for them to be able to say at least support war efforts in 3 different world regions. I'm not suggesting that they're taking part in wars, but I mean, again, Ukraine, the Middle East, Asia. I mean, it's almost imperial overstretch. I think that's very, very difficult to sustain. And I mean, what I fear is that the Trump administration might really say, "Hey, we focus on China and maybe the Middle East, but we pull out of NATO, and the Europeans have to take care of that." That might happen.
I think it's a very correct observation, because I feel the West is still kind of leaves with this concept of like we're still trying to achieve the Western world as in the Western as in global world, because I think it's true to say that the West always conflates itself with the world. So it's almost like whenever the West says something, it kind of like projects itself on the world, which I mean, of course, it's like there's a lot of,
or at least as a role model, that's sort of something to emulate. I mean, because we're democracies, we build up the best kind of way of economies, and I mean our sort of way of life is the one that I think people look up to or would like to live.
And I think rhetorically, it has never accepted the fact that the world is multipolar. I think whenever you read of course, what they call it's like there is like this power struggle between great powers right now. But they're still kind of living in this concept that we are going to the world that is eventually Western for everyone. And it has never really reconciled with the fact that maybe it's not the case. And of course, and again, the tension is here between, again, the US and China. And coming back to the American elections, right? Because I feel obviously the US looks at this struggle as it looks at the struggle between the United States and USSR, right? It's like eventually one should lose. One concept should really lose, and I mean, of course, they bet that their vision will eventually win. Which again, also interesting because, as what we discussed before the podcast, there is a lot of contingency in American institutions. There is not so much contingency in Chinese institutions. Of course, China is like very old civilization. But well, China as a system is still there for 70 years. So to predict Chinese future in this type of arrangement for another 100 years may be tricky, especially for Russian arrangement. I mean, so this is like the game that they start kind of playing in this, coming back to geopolitics, right? It's like, who is going to survive the most? It's almost like, and then you're just like, it's interesting to understand like who plays those games. It's like, is it like the US as an organism, or like because it's interesting to understand because it seems like they play this game, right? Who survives the most, right? Or whose system kind of like.
Well, who survives the most sounds a bit awkward because who survives or which country survives?
Which system, like, system, like not.
But I think there the analysis. If you talk to historians who take a very long perspective of centuries or millennia, they might actually suggest that the Chinese system, even the one of the Communist Party now, is structurally very much in line with previous, say, dynasties even. For me, that's a tricky observation. So this entire thing about continuity and change. So,
but that's
which factors do you draw when you look at, is that really something that is a new development, or is that basically a sort of historical tradition or a continuity?
No, but I would say it's like this is like cultural civilization, and this is of course very different because like obviously there is no connection between current Chinese government and the government 2,000 years ago. Of course, you can have some cultural continuity, but in the US system, and of course maybe that's the biggest invention of European power institution is this idea of continuity, because of course there is a continuity between George Washington and Donald Trump, for example, if he becomes the president. There's like a real continuity in terms of like it's just the same system, which allows for the system to accumulate wealth, to project its power, and like
at the same time you could argue that even if the sort of on paper or in terms of the organizational chart, the Chinese Communist Party is now very different from any kind of dynasty that was governing China. The way that the society is organized, the way that the administrative processes are being conducted, that there are a lot of similarities in that regard. And that's why even some Chinese now, sort of especially in the West, or if they're not in China, criticize Xi Jinping by calling him or referring to him as the new emperor. But of course, that's supposed to be criticism.
Yeah.
So but at the same time, it is a confirmation that he himself seems to believe in this kind of historical continuity.
Yeah.
And that there are some things that the modern Chinese state has in common with its predecessors. And there are the same arguments, right, about Russian politics, where some people even compare. Of course, you have this cliche-like thing that every terrible politician is the new Hitler. That's something we discussed already, and it doesn't go very far analytically. Mm-hmm. But there are a number of people who also seem to compare Putin to a Tsar, and say, in the way how he holds power, how he concentrates power over time, the way how he also ensures that there is nobody who is actually able to control him or reduce his power, or that, I mean, everyone that he may threaten his rule, that he sort of ensures that this person no longer has the power, maybe by falling out of a window or things like that. But I mean, in that sense, it's always a question whether of course, you're right that George Washington and Donald Trump have held the same position, that of the US president, but of course the US political system changed over time.
I mean, it changed, but it survived as a sort of a mechanism of continuous accumulation of whatever. Because I mean, Russian system is a good case. I mean, yes, Russia kind of like, it has like as a phoenix effect, right? It kind of like collapses and rises back again. But like at the same time, it like every time it collapses, it loses significant influence, right? And every time it shrinks, basically. I mean, I'm not sure about Chinese system, because I mean, it's hard for me to say. I'm not that familiar with the Chinese political landscape, but of course there are a lot of vulnerabilities in the system, especially with also separatism and stuff like this, that can have detrimental effects in the future. It's not to say that American system is bulletproof and there is no chance it will collapse in the future. I mean, of course it can collapse, but at least it kind of survived all those years of different like epochs of instability, and it kind of still emerged as the one system, whereas both Chinese and Russian systems, they do not seem to be as kind of like stable. Of course, and this is just if we talk about from institutional perspective, because I guess institutions from perspective of geopolitics, what allows really the US to kind of continuously project its power and accumulate resources and stuff like this. This is what just from my personal observation, which
I mean, that's due to the institutional setup.
Yes, and which allows it. I mean, again, there are not so many countries in the world that survived that long with the same type of arrangement. Of course, Great Britain would be another one, which maybe it has also some similarities because they both kind of built on the similar architecture, which is interesting.
So maybe that's something we should discuss next time.
Yes.
Political institutions.
Yes, and how they impact geopolitics. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, David.